So we want to ask the question, how do disciples live in this world?
Well, disciples live in the world, but they're in the world, but they're not of it. They are distinctive even as they permeate a dark world with light. And that light is the light of Christ.
Think about this from the kingdom parables, I like to call the disciple-making parables. Matthew 13:44. The kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field. When a man found it, he hid it again, and then in his joy went and sold all he had, and he bought that field.
So let me talk a little bit about making disciples and how you can have this impact that we're talking about. You know, there's a lot of ideas about like how do you start. So I just want to talk about, let's look at how Jesus started, since he's our model.
That's right.
And we want to emulate after him. Do you know that Jesus started his ministry with 40 days of fasting and prayer? Then he invited people into his life and he got to know them. And some people think that it was like a group of 90 people before Jesus spent the night in prayer. And after spending the night in prayer, he picks the 12 to invest in. So the first thing we want to recommend to everybody is when you decide you want to make disciples like Jesus, we encourage you to start with praying. Pray about it for a while and really seek clarity that God would lead you and guide you. And then the second thing that we would talk about is, again, being like Jesus, it's investing in a few. In fact, not only did Jesus invest in the 12, but there was the 3, Peter, James, and John, that he focused on. And then even Paul, when Paul tells Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 2.
I love that verse.
About discipling. Here's what Paul said to Timothy. He said to Timothy, Timothy, that which you have heard me say in the presence of many witnesses, Timothy, take that and entrust it to reliable people who are able to teach others. So what you have is Paul to Timothy to reliable people to others, which is 4 generations, which is great, but it's starting small. It's find these people and invest in them. Talk to us about the idea of small.
Small. Think smaller than small. You know, when we think small group.
Yeah.
And if your church is like mine, small group means 12, 14, 16. And it means you meet for an hour a week, maybe do a little. I mean, when Jesus is thinking about disciple making, he's saying, look at what is smaller than small. And you remember the kingdom parables, the disciple making parables, where he talks about the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed. And he says it's the smallest seed in the garden, like smaller than a poppy seed. You can just barely hold them between 2 fingers. And he said, but when you plant that in the ground, you let it grow, that little beginning goes up into a tree that is 30 feet tall, 20 feet wide at its spread. The birds are in this tree. And all of a sudden, I mean, you can't call it a bush anymore, it's a tree. It reminds me of the crepe myrtle. Have you ever had a crepe myrtle where you've had to decide, is that a bush or has that become a tree? You know, and it starts small, but with God's power, with God's influence, with the Holy Spirit, all of a sudden you see that God is able to do incredible things with small.
That's so good. You know, when I think back on my life, the investment of discipling my children, or you discipling your children, Scott, we're fortunate that our children follow Jesus. And then you think of the other people over the years that you invested the time in, and then you just look at, and I can see in some cases, multiple generations of disciples making disciples. And the idea of really investing and going small, but going deep. And then God made it really big.
So to summarize what Bobby said a minute ago, I think we're at the point where the big question is, are you sold that disciple making is the core mission of the church? And if it is, what does that require of us? Because for me, when I discover that disciple making is what the Great Commission's all about, it's taking the Great Commandment and putting it into practice, then I have to ask the question, how do I go about becoming a disciple maker?
That's right.
And what you said is pray about it.
Yeah.
Fast, pray, really make sure that when you begin this journey that you're committed to it and that God's fingerprints are on it, right?
Yeah.
But then I think you need to find somebody. Don't you? Somebody at your church that you're going to talk to about, I think I'm ready to...
Maybe an elder or people on the ministerial staff, and just say, hey, I got to do this.
Yeah.
And you want to, we encourage you, since it's the core mission of the church, to connect with the church about that. Hopefully your church has this as a thing that the church does. If not, consult with them and say, hey, I want to do this, but I want to do it in sync with you, and get a plan and get some people and make the commitment, right, Scott?
Make the commitment, because once you begin, it is such an exciting journey. It is so meaningful. And to look at people's lives and to realize that you're not the same person you were a year ago, they're not the same person they were a year ago. And quite frankly, over time, your church isn't the same church that it was a year ago either, right?
That's right.
But it all begins with being intentional, relational formation. And we just want to challenge you to make that beginning. Pray, fast, talk to somebody, and ask the question, what would it look like for me to be a disciple who makes disciples who make disciples? We're convinced that's the core mission of the church.